Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groom. I'm Asbed Bedrossian. In this Conversations on Groom episode, Hovik Manucharyan, Asbed Kotchikian, and I will be talking about the Armenian parliamentary elections coming up on June 20th. This episode was recorded on Monday, June 7th, 2021, Yerevan time. Different political forces in Armenia have coalesced and are geared up to participate in what could be the most competitive elections in the country's recent 25-year history. We're interviewing representatives of the various contending parties in the elections to discuss and understand not only their strategy in the elections, but also how they plan to meet the immediate challenges facing Armenia in the post-war period. One of those parties, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnaktsutyun, ARF-Dashnaktsutyun, has had a long history of operating both as a political organization in the diasporas as well as a political party in Armenia.
To have this conversation, today we are joined with Giro Manoyan, who has been a member of the ARF-Dashnaktsutyun Bureau since 2015. Giro is originally from Beirut, Lebanon. He moved to Montreal, Canada in 1976 and attended Concordia University, where he studied political science. He has served as the Executive Secretary of the Armenian National Committee of Canada, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of the Horizon Armenian Weekly. In 1999, he moved to Yerevan and has served as the Executive Director of the Bureau of the ARF-Dashnaktsutyun, the highest executive body, in charge of the Armenian Cause, Tahd Central Committee. Welcome, Giro.
Hello, Giro.
Hello.
Hi, Giro.
Hi, everyone.
To kick off our conversation today, let's start with the past couple of years in Armenian politics, specifically in 2018. The ARF initially supported Pashinyan's candidacy for prime minister in May 2018, but soon after that, it was excluded from the National Assembly following the December of the same year's elections. It became increasingly critical of the government. Giro, what are your thoughts about the state of the Armenian government in Armenia since Pashinyan and Maistep came to power in 2018?
Well, in 2018, the ARF not only supported Pashinyan's candidacy, but agreed with Pashinyan's invitation and for a short time from May to early October joined the government even. It had two ministers, but the disagreements actually were there even before joining the coalition, although Pashinyan did not want to call it a coalition, and after initially agreeing, did not realize the signing of a coalition agreement, and the ARF was not the only party which went along with joining the government, but disagreements, as I said, were there even before joining the government, only because Pashinyan himself, who had been in parliament for the previous several years, had, and before that he had been an editor of his newspaper. His newspaper had demonstrated that there are several points on which we disagree. But the ARF agreed to join in the government only because in 2018, whatever you want to call it, Velvet Revolution or popular movement, the people really gained self-confidence that they are able to change the government as they wish. And to encourage that, the ARF agreed to join in the government. But early October, that is exactly when Pashinyan, contrary to the verbal agreement that the extraordinary elections will be held within a year, decided to hold the elections after 6-7 months of forming the new government. And he was actually the one who started to call the other parties who were in the government that they were conspiring against the government and during a public meeting in early October, he announced the dismissal of the ministers when actually a couple of minutes before that, the ministers had themselves resigned the cabinet. So
Yeah,
this
you
was
can't
all
fire me, I quit kind of a situation, right?
well before before he had fired them, they had actually quit, and really the atmosphere in the country, political atmosphere in the country, was tense because immediately before the mayoral elections of Yerevan, Pashinyan adopted a policy of black and white. Literally, that's what they called, that those who were with them were white and those who were competing were so-called black. And actually, an atmosphere was created that made cooperating pretty difficult. And this is in addition to the disagreements over policies. And the main problems were regarding national security and foreign policy, but also the way he was handling the internal politics in the country. So
Right.
since then, actually, we think that My Step Alliance or the My Step bloc in the National Assembly and its government have done a lot of mistakes, both on the internal front and on foreign policy issues, mainly targeting almost all institutions, starting from the army up to the Armenian Church, and school curriculums regarding Armenian history, Armenian church history, etc. So the atmosphere in the country was tense up to the war of 2020, the 44-day war of Artsakh, which started in September 2020. So actually, even before the war, the ARF was speaking about extraordinary elections because the situation in the country had changed. The approach of a significant segment of the population regarding the government was changing, but then the war started and things developed from there.
So when exactly did the ARF start negotiating with Nikol Pashinyan about election, the parliamentary vote? Because I think officially the ARF announced their support for Pashinyan on April 25. But I think for history, we would like to know when you were approached by Nikol Pashinyan or vice versa, and when did those negotiations actually start?
During the movement, we were in contact with Pashinyan, even when he was arrested for a couple of days. We had the chairman of the bureau visiting him and directly meeting with him. After his release, we had meetings with him and several of his close colleagues in their party. And at that time, Pashinyan's approach was, look, guys, I don't consider you to be part of those I'm blaming, namely the Republican Party. And actually, I consider our agenda to be the same as your agenda. And so from the beginning, there was, from his side, mainly an approach that if we can do this together, let's do this together. And actually, he became prime minister on May 8th. By then, we still did not have a decision to join anything because he became prime minister only on May 8th. As you know, there was an attempt a first attempt to elect him as prime minister on May 1st,
Right.
but he was not elected. And on May 8th, he was elected. So his approach was after May 8th, his approach that we join the cabinet. And there were some negotiations, but more internal party discussions. The ARF held internal discussions, and eventually it agreed to join. It wasn't that it was a foregone conclusion when we supported his candidacy as prime minister. And the reason we supported his candidacy as prime minister was that the situation was as such that the political activism would not have stopped, and the country would not have started to function again had not those street demonstrations stopped. And without his election as prime minister, all those would not have stopped.
This is interesting because this is an example. I mean, you guys have been struggling with the word coalition government, joining cabinet, and so on. This is quite a common phenomenon in many European countries, West European countries, where you have minority governments, where a party which doesn't have a majority in the parliament ends up, forming government with the tacit approval of a majority of the people in the parliament without actually supporting them being part of a coalition. So it was a minority government supported by a majority of the parliamentarians, the National Assembly. So that's the definition that we were looking for.
Actually, the Republican Party did not support him.
Right.
But it said it lets its so-called businessmen members of their parliamentary faction feel free to decide whether they want to support Pashinyan or not. So the non-business people of the Republican Party in Parliament did not really support him.
Right.
And our approach, that this is happening after his election as prime minister by the National Assembly, was that if we're joining, then we should have a written agreement as a coalition, which was something we actually had helped being introduced in Armenia during Kotchikian's second term. Because up until then, during Levan Bedrossian's presidency and first term of Kotchikian, in fact, there were multi-party governments, but they weren't coalitions in the classical sense. Meaning, the chief executive would decide, okay, I want this guy from these parties. If the parties agreed, that was it. So it was a multi-party cabinet, but there was no formal agreement on the policies of what that multi-party cabinet will be doing. We introduced that after the 2003 presidential elections, when we formed a coalition under then President Kotchikian, and that was a practice we were expecting to happen this time as well, but Pashinyan did not agree at the end. Yeah. He didn't say no at the beginning, but at the end he did not agree.
So fast forward 2 years or so, and the September War, 2.5 years, September War in 2020. Almost all, if not all, of the global Armenian nation mobilized its resources for the defense of Artsakh, along with the ARF. Do you think that this war could have been avoided or not? And what were the steps that led us to this war?
It was becoming clear that a war is imminent. Not only because of what was Armenia doing or not doing, but also because of what Azerbaijan was doing. But could that have been avoided on exactly unhappening exactly when it happened? Most probably yes.
Giro, when you say that it was becoming evident that there was something imminent, for how long do you think it was becoming evident? Are we talking about a month, 6 months, or a year?
Well, we should remember that a couple of months before the September war started,
July.
By Azerbaijan in July, there were skirmishes on the northeastern border of the Republic of
Tavush
Armenia
section,
with
yes.
Azerbaijan, yes,
Mhm.
in Davush. And not only that was an expression actually, but the rhetoric on both sides, it was clear that Pashinyan did not really have a clear policy on how he wants to lead the negotiations, although the negotiations had not made any real movement even before 2016. That was one expression, the 2016 four-day war, what we call, demonstrated. But there were negotiations at least, and there were agreements reached after the 2016 four-day war. But when Pashinyan came, it was obvious that he wanted to change the paradigm, the negotiations paradigm, but it wasn't clear what route he wanted to take. And that was creating a situation where the intermediaries, the co-chair countries of the OSCE Minsk group, namely US, Russia, and France, were starting to disagree with the approach that the new Armenian government had taken, first starting with questioning the so-called Madrid principles,
Right.
and then in August 2019 announcing that Artsakh is Armenia and that's it. This sounded very nice, but actually it wasn't really meant for so-called foreign audience. It was more of an internal issue for Pashinyan, meaning that he wants to be directly and openly involved in the internal political developments of Artsakh by saying Artsakh is Armenia and that's it. Because he didn't take any political action that would affect on the foreign front regarding this statement. So all these had indicated, and as I said, the movements by Azerbaijan, the rhetoric by Azerbaijan, they made clear that at some point eventually there will be war, but not with such results, of course.
And once the war started, Giro, was there any indicator, at least from your perspective or from the ARF perspective, that it was going to end up the way it did? In other words, were there any indicators that the war was going in a way that it would result in utter defeat? The humiliating defeat, if you want to call it, the way it did.
Even on the second day of the war, we asked for a meeting with Pashinyan, and that was granted. And it was concern that we expressed to him that it's not clear what is it that we want to do. In the following days also, there was another meeting with him, continuing the expression of concern that it's still not clear what the government is trying to do, because on the third day of the war, the general mobilization actually stopped. It was not clear what was the reason, what was the plan behind that. So, no, it was not clear that this will be the result of the war, but all along there was concern that it's not clear what are we trying to do. And as you know, I'm sure, we had sent several hundred volunteers in the starting even the first part of that were sent on before midnight or around midnight, September 27, 28. And so we started also receiving information from the ground that how the war is being handled on the front. Of course, all this was in coordination with the Ministry of Defense. I mean, even the transportation buses were provided by the Ministry of Defense for those volunteers to go from Armenia, Republic of Armenia to Republic of Artsakh, and everything else was coordinated with the Ministry of Defense. But there were also concerns, and those concerns were expressed to Pashinyan in the following meetings after the September 28 meeting with him. But again, it was not clear what he wanted to really achieve and how he wanted to achieve that. So it was not clear from the beginning how things will end, but it was clear that it's not going to end in a way that will be favorable to us. And all this, we should remember, in an atmosphere of a public relations campaign by the government saying, we're winning, we will win, we're winning, we will win.
Right.
And suddenly the situation is not only we didn't, we lost very badly.
Right. So 6 months since the signing of November 10 agreement, November 10th declaration, even that is not, a lot of people have different names, calling it different names. And now we're facing the snap parliamentary elections. The ARF, for the first time in the Republic's history, the Third Republic's history, has forged an electoral alliance with former President Asbed Kotchikian under the name of ARF-Dashnaktsutyun. The latest polls, as unreliable as they might be, but they show a trend that the civic contract and the ARF-Dashnaktsutyuns are neck to neck in the elections. First of all, what are your assessment of the way the upcoming elections are shaping up?
Regardless of what several polls might say, and as I agree that they're not all very reliable, on the ground it's clear that there is a shift towards the Hayastan alliance, the Hayastan bloc. I mean, by just talking to the people, you see that. But of course, Pashinyan, and personally Pashinyan, continues to have a following, although it seems to have gone really down. I'm not comparing it with December 2018. I'm comparing it with just a couple of months before the elections were called. And it is clear that there is a shift of public opinion, but there are also other parties involved in the elections. You were right that this is the first time in the Third Republic's history that the ARF has decided to participate in the elections in an electoral alliance bloc. Before the elections, we may have joined coalitions, but it was after elections and based on election results. But it was clear that these are not regular elections. I don't refer only to the fact that they're early elections or snap elections, but that this is not. These are not elections so that we see which party goes in with how many votes from the people, but this we consider to be elections between continuing the existence of Armenian statehood and, if not, then the possibility of losing the statehood. So that
Which
is
raises,
the main.
that raises the issue that there are many issues facing the country post-war Armenia, right? We have the issues of the pandemic, we have the economic issues, we have the war and the aftermath, and also loss of land and other priorities. So in this context, different political parties have their own platform, their agendas about how to handle the issue in totality, not just the issue of security and national security and border security and so on. What are the ARF's priorities in a new coming government, regardless if they come in or not? And more importantly, as a member of a faction, as a member of an electoral bloc, to what extent the bloc actually shares and to what extent it doesn't share some of ARF's priorities in regards to policies, post-election Armenia's government policies.
The election platform of the bloc has been published, and I can say that a great majority of that platform is based on the ARF's approaches. The ARF actually, before eventually deciding to form a bloc, was preparing for an eventuality of snap elections, so it was preparing a platform in case it ran alone, and the great majority of that draft is actually the platform of the bloc. And the priorities, of course, are, as you mentioned, on several fronts: to stop the security threats that Armenia, Republic of Armenia, is facing,
Right.
not only Artsakh, and to start reversing the developments that have started taking place both in the economy and in all other sectors. And of course, this will be a very difficult task if the Dashnaktsutyun is elected to form the government alone or in coalition with others in the National Assembly. But actually, until today, there still is concern whether the elections will take place on June 20th and whether there won't be any developments, both externally and internally, that suddenly will stop that process. I mean, the elections from taking place on June 20th.
Reignition of war, possibly? I mean, is that a possibility, Giro?
Well, reignition of war is one. The establishment of a state of
emergency
war, a state of war in Republic of Armenia is another. Doesn't have to be a big war initiated by Azerbaijan to declare such a situation, such a state of the legal situation in Armenia. So things may happen, but on the other hand, also we expect or hope that eventually the elections will take place.
Now, is there any possibility, Giro, that in the event of Dashnaktsutyun managing to get a majority or forming a coalition to govern, the priorities that you mentioned in terms of the platform and so on, you might face limitations both internally and externally? In other words, renegotiating the November 10 agreement or, a border demarcation. Do you foresee any limitations or any possibilities that you might face unforeseen challenges?
Well, it's not unforeseen that the November 9-10 joint trilateral declaration is not up for negotiations, but the November 9-10 trilateral joint declaration does not resolve the Artsakh problem. It only stops the war and calls on Armenian side to withdraw from regions, areas which it already has withdrawn from. So you cannot change that by saying, I don't like this point in the joint declaration. But there are other issues which are now being pursued by Azerbaijan, so-called a corridor for Azerbaijan through Syunik. Well, not necessarily Merli, through Syunik in the south to Nakhichevan. That's an interpretation Azerbaijan is pushing forward, although there is no mention of any corridor per se in the trilateral joint declaration, but the interpretation by Azerbaijan is that there should be a corridor provided to it. Armenia is saying that there is no such agreement in the trilateral declaration, and Russia, which was the mediatory and a signatory of the trilateral declaration, doesn't really say there is an agreement for a corridor. But there are other negotiations going on. So, I mean, of course, we realize that there are limitations on what we can do, but we also realize that there are things that will be negotiated eventually. The priority is to stop the movement, the Azerbaijani movement in coalition with Turkey against the Republic of Armenia, the reorganization of the armed forces, and of course, a great section of the platform deals with is economy, social issues, health, education, etc., because that will help also the people to try to stand up, because with the war and with the trilateral declaration, we not only lost 5,000 of our young men, around 11,000, 12,000 are wounded, and we lost a lot of land, over 10,000 square kilometers of land in Artsakh. But also there is a psychological situation with the people, and I believe not only in Artsakh and in the Republic of Armenia, but I'm sure in at least some segments of the Armenian diaspora, that has to be changed. I mean, overnight, when we were winning the war, so-called, we lost it and lost it terribly. And that psychological state of mind should be really changed, and we hope to change that with the steps that the government will take.
Giro, I have a quick question, but I don't want to delay too long. But so your opponents in this political campaign, one of the subtexts that is being sort of said is that if the ARF and ARF-Dashnaktsutyun come to power, there might be new war. So I'd like you to address that. And the other is that how could the ARF-Dashnaktsutyun help change any of the terms, or is there any possibility to change the terms? And if not, then Pashinyan is saying basically that you agree with the November 10 declaration. So why do you want to come to power?
The November 9-10 trilateral declaration is not waiting for anybody to agree with or disagree with. It was signed, it was declared, and actions were taken based on that joint declaration, including from the Armenian side the release of all POWs and even non-POW,
including criminals.
Azerbaijani prisoners being held in Armenia. Some were released, some Armenian POWs and other hostages were released by Azerbaijan, but the major one is that the fighting has stopped, that there is a Russian peacekeeping force in place in and around Artsakh, and that Armenian forces withdrew from very large chunks of territory where there were no fightings during the last war. So it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing, it's a matter of how you can move forward with a political power which has lost a war the way it did. Look, I'm talking about from the standpoint of a political party, the ARF, which back in 1920, 100 years before this, when it was clear that it lost the war with Turkey. September War started, which Turkey started back in 1920. The ARF eventually decided to hand power to the communists. And as is said that the Armenians decided, actually the ARF decided that Armenia should be read better than dead. We have been calling for the present government to resign just because as a losing side, you cannot, not only that you're the side, but you're the individual, you're the political power which has lost. You cannot really negotiate first with your enemy or opponent, whatever you want to call him, and then negotiate with partners or allies, because you're the losing side, you're the losing person, you're the losing political power. So that has to change. And the twists that Pashinyan likes to bring or continues to bring in political discourse, just as like he is still the editor-in-chief of a newspaper, being smart about it, quote unquote, that's not how you run a country. We have seen just the physical expression, how he sat in January of this year during the trilateral meeting in Moscow with Aliyev and Putin. Just the way he was sitting, I can imagine what he was talking. But even as recently as last week, his visit to France, the way he was walking towards French President Macron, again, shows this is not the same person we saw in 2018. Even in the internal regarding his campaign speeches, and not only campaign speeches, chairing the government meeting, cabinet meeting, etc. It's very clear that he's a broken person, and he cannot lead the country out of this current situation if you're the losing, broken, not only side, but the person and the political power. So that has to change. And of course, the mistakes he made before the war, during the war, with Armenia's relations with Russia, with Iran, even with others, when they were trying to help stop the war, mainly with France. The way he dealt with France, everybody has really, I believe, given up on him and is expecting a new government, a new political force with a clear mandate from the people.
Have the last 6 months of events changed the way that the Dasnaktsutyun views the cause of Artsakh, its right for self-determination? Has anything changed in your views? How do you approach that?
In that sense, no. But obviously, the situation on the ground has turned upside down. So regarding the aim, the goal, the target of how to resolve the Artsakh issue, what is the resolution, is not really changed, meaning we believe that Artsakh should continue to stay Armenian, and that is by having an large Armenian population. Second, reinstating the territorial integrity of the Republic of Artsakh, which was declared September 2, 1991, and eventually gaining international recognition for the independence of Artsakh. But we don't hide anything. Our aim is to have Artsakh united with the Republic of Armenia. But because of the conditions in 1991 and the following years, this approach was adopted. and this is how the international community has viewed or approached the issue in the past decades. So the steps should be taken to continue. I mean, we mentioned the transition article, the article in the Artsakh Republic Constitution relating to the control of territories in the transition period, so-called, and we believe that article still satisfies the needs, meaning reinstatement of the territorial integrity and international recognition for the independence.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. The ARF obviously is one of the major Armenian organizations spanning our global community, from the Republic to the Middle East, Europe, the Americas. Are you satisfied with the level of Armenia-diaspora relations? And what is your vision for where these relations could be or should be?
Not that we have found the magic answer to the issue, but I think no concerned Armenian, much less an organization which functions both in the diaspora and in Armenia and in the Republic of Artsakh, is satisfied with, we rather call it motherland, homeland, and diaspora cooperation, because the diaspora is not a single unit, but the Republic of Armenia, at least as the Republic, is a single unit which has its elected or otherwise government bodies, etc. Of course, it has a population difference on many issues, including cooperation with the diaspora, but the diaspora as such is not a single unit, meaning I don't think anybody can clearly say, well, this is what the diaspora is expecting of Armenia. So, and we rather talk about cooperation between the two, but of course they're not on a satisfactory level, especially with, again, the changes that the Pashinyan government made. It was clear that those relations, that cooperation, will not develop any further than it had when Republic of Armenia had the Ministry of Diaspora.
Can you say more about those specific changes? What are you referring to?
Well, just the fact that the Ministry of Diaspora was removed from the government without consultation with any diaspora organization.
I see. Changing from a ministry to a, let's say, High Commissioner's office.
That really demonstrates the whole approach. We are concerned about you. I mean, Yerevan telling the diaspora communities, we are concerned about you, and we know best how to deal with your problems, but I don't need to ask you what you think, how I should do or what I should do.
Yeah.
And the new office within the Prime Minister's office, the new office for the actual, the Commissioner for Diaspora, it was clear that its functions were limited as well. It criticized the ministry before, not that we say the ministry did a perfect job, but there were some activities that the ministry had initiated during the 10-year of its existence. But when the conditions permitted, it took initiatives, just the exact same initiatives that the ministry was taking. I mean, students coming to the homeland, etc., just renaming the programs, but in essence, them being the same. But anyway, to answer more correctly your question, we're not satisfied, and that is a two-way street, really. The great majority of responsibility lies with the government of Armenia, whoever it is, because, as I said, it's the main actor in this relationship, but also on the diaspora organizations, communities themselves, because they have to also decide what they want to do, and not only in relations with Armenia or Artsakh, but also to exist as communities outside the homeland. So we're not at a level that we have satisfactory answers to all those questions. But one thing is clear, that there should be more participation from the diaspora in Armenia's affairs.
Does that include political affairs?
Well, regarding political affairs, there are two main things, really. One is, this might sound a bit self-centered maybe, but it's I assure you it's not. As dual citizens living in Armenia, they are, with all the existing laws, and this is not only part of this government's steps, but that's how it has developed, although there has been movement forward in Armenia. If you're living in Armenia and have dual citizenship, or more than Armenian citizenship, you're a suspect. Politically, you're a suspect. You cannot become a judge. You cannot become member of the State Commission on Television and Radio Broadcasting. Let alone you cannot become member of parliament. You cannot become a minister, etc., etc. Not that there are a lot of those who may have become, but just putting that limitation there is a problem. So in the political daily life, at least for Armenians living in Armenia, but who have more than Armenian citizenship, other citizenships as well. And the second one, of course, is Armenian citizens living abroad lost their right to participate in elections or referenda in Armenia when the law on dual citizenship was adopted back in 2007. It was Kotchikian was still the president. He really did not have a problem with that, but the Republican Party then, who had the majority members of parliament, the largest number of members of parliament, at the last moment said, if you want this law to go through, you have to agree that we change the election law of Armenia, meaning we make elections of Armenia, of state organs of Armenia, be held only on the territory of Armenia.
Right. You have to be in Armenia to be able to vote.
Exactly, except if you're a member of the diplomatic corps serving abroad, right, and your family. So that law was changed, and we have called things to change, but Kotchikian himself even said that he thinks that right should be reinstated, that Armenian citizens living abroad should be able to participate in elections or referenda, and maybe some limitations on Armenians, because, for example, if you want, even if you only have Armenian citizenship, you have to have had only Armenian citizenship for the last 4 years to be a candidate for parliament, to be member of the cabinet, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So there are things that may change and make it more flexible to make use of all of our nation's capabilities, both in the Republic of Armenia and in the diaspora.
So, Giro, We went from the Armenia to Diaspora. Now let's just as a concluding sort of discussion or one of our last discussion points, let's go into the micro level of the ARF specifically. As Asbed Bedrossian mentioned, the ARF is a large organization, global community, many countries, even within countries, there are so many different groups, chapters and so on. Recently, there has been friction inside the ARF, and very uncharacteristically, the internal rift has spilled outside the party. What I'm talking about is basically in March of this year, there was a bureau statement about the U.S. West Coast Central Committee, and there were counter statements by the U.S. West Coast group of ARFers about the bureau. Could you, if you don't mind, give us some insight into what was the root cause of that rift?
Well, most probably I won't respond satisfactorily to your inquiry, but I would say these are internal organizational matters. Just like any political organization, there is internal politics too. And in years, there were issues added one on top of the other in the west coast of the U.S., in the western U.S. region of the ARF. And this situation is an expression of those accumulated problems. I agree that it's not characteristic of the ARF to talk about internal political matters out in the open, but depending on the severity of the issue, it has been done in the past too. I'm referring to in the 1930s,
in
the
France.
so-called Martgotsagan in France, the so-called Martgotsagan Sharjum, named after the newspaper they started publishing, Martgots. The ARF Bureau has publicly, even back then, informed the public that this group, which claims to be speaking on behalf of the ARF in the region, does not represent the ARF. So that's actually what the ARF Bureau did, and made clear that there is one ARF legitimate body based on the bylaws and statutes of the party, and the group which claims it represents the ARF ranks or body in the West region is not that legitimate body.
Right. This is actually quite interesting. Again, respecting your right not to answer or give details, but the timing of that rift, it's quite interesting in the sense that it happened, probably the origins of the rift started way before, as you mentioned, but the timing happening after the war and the increasing tension in Armenia, internal political dimension or the internal political scene in Armenia, it just that raised, a lot of eyebrows. And again, coupled with the fact that the ARF almost always solves its issues internally without actually putting its dirty laundry out there. It seems that this was quite an interesting phenomenon or an occurrence. So, but how do you see, or is this rift resolved, or are there any attempts at reconciling the party or members of the party in the Western region? And have you moved forward, or this is still an ongoing issue, as we have heard, or some people in the Western region have heard from different people?
Well, of course, there is no good time for such problems within any organization, and in this case, the ARF, to appear. But I agree that this is really the worst time that this could have happened. But these are the conditions outside the organization and unrelated to the organizational issues could not have, or at least that's how we as the Bureau could not have affected on how to approach an organizational matter. As for the current situation, within a month, 5-6 weeks, there will be a legal meaning based on the statutes and bylaws of the ARF regional convention in the Western region. A great majority of the membership of the ranks and files in the region adhere to the statutes and the bylaws. The great majority of the local committees, comites, adhere to the ARF bylaws and statutes. So there will be a new regional convention held, and which should be electing a new central committee for the region. And that's the route we have taken. There is still a group. We'll see how they react to the regional convention, but there still is a group which, contrary to the statutes and bylaws, claims to be the legitimate representative of the ARF, which they are not. But we'll see how things develop following next month's regional convention.
Interesting.
Well,
it's not like the whole region is outside of the big ARF family, the large ARF family.
Of course.
The region is part, but there is a group in the region which is actually outside the regional organization and hence the ARF. But the region as such is part of the family.
Right. I mean, this is not uncommon. I mean, there have been many other similar cases that most of us know of, even though it's like the worst kept secret about similar events in other regions, but they've always been wrapped. So I would like to thank you again, Giro, for this insights and your perspectives on issues ranging from Armenia's politics, Armenia diaspora, the upcoming elections, but also about recent developments on the U.S. Western region of the ARF. We wish you good luck, and thank you for joining us in this conversation.
Thanks for having me, and hopefully things will run smoothly from today to the election day, and the people, citizens of Armenia living in Armenia will have the opportunity to really express their opinion on who should govern the country.
Amen to that.
Thank you, Giro. We very much appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes this Conversations on Grung episode. We hope it was helpful in your understanding of some of the issues involved. We look forward to your feedback, including your suggestions for conversation topics in the future. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.